The possession of Anna Ecklund. I remember the first time I heard about Anna Ecklund. It was a cold, gray afternoon in 1928, and the wind howled through the barren trees, rattling the window panes of my small, dimly lit office. A letter had arrived, bearing the seal of a distant convent in Iowa, a place I'd never heard of before. The words on the page were desperate, pleading. A priest by the name of Father Theophilus Riesinger was seeking help, and he mentioned a name that sent a chill down my spine. Anna Ecklund. I had heard whispers of her before. A young woman plagued by something far beyond the realms of the natural. The stories were wild, unbelievable, but the urgency in the priest's words made it impossible to dismiss them. According to him, Anna had been subjected to several failed exorcisms over the years, and now, the entity within her had grown more powerful, more malevolent. The convent, a place meant for peace and solace, had become a battleground. The nuns spoke of eerie occurrences, objects moving on their own, unearthly growls echoing through the halls at night, and the terrifying sight of Anna's body contorting in ways that defied human anatomy. But it was her eyes, they said, that were the most horrifying. Once a vibrant blue, they now burned with an unnatural searing yellow, like the eyes of a beast from the depths of hell. I decided to travel to Iowa, drawn by a morbid curiosity and a sense of duty to uncover the truth. The journey was long and arduous, but nothing could have prepared me for what I would encounter upon my arrival. The convent loomed ahead, its stone walls darkened by the overcast sky. The atmosphere was thick with dread, a tangible fear that seemed to seep from the very ground beneath my feet. I was greeted by Father Riesinger, a man with deep-set eyes and a face etched with the burden of what he had witnessed. "She's been waiting for you," he said, his voice heavy with foreboding. I could see the fear in his eyes, a fear that was mirrored in the faces of the nuns who hurried past, avoiding my gaze as if I were bringing some dark omen with me. We made our way to the room where Anna was kept, the heavy wooden door creaking open to reveal a scene that would haunt me forever. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur, and the walls were covered in deep scratches as if some wild animal had been trying to claw its way out. But the most terrifying sight was Anna herself. She was strapped to the bed, her wrists and ankles bound by thick leather straps. Her once beautiful face was now gaunt, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her hair, matted and greasy, clung to her skull in tangled clumps. And then those eyes. They locked onto mine with a hatred so intense it felt like a physical blow. The moment I stepped into the room, the temperature plummeted, and I could see my breath misting in the cold air. Anna's body convulsed violently, and a guttural voice, not her own, escaped her lips. You have no power here!" it hissed, the voice so distorted it was almost unrecognizable as human. The room seemed to vibrate with an unseen force, and I could feel a pressure building in my chest, as if the very air around me was being sucked out, leaving only a void of darkness. Father Riesinger began the exorcism, his voice steady as he recited the ancient rites, but it was clear that this would be no ordinary battle. The entity within Anna fought back with a ferocity that I had never seen before. Her body twisted and contorted, bones cracking in ways that made my stomach churn. Her voice, no, the voice of whatever was inside her, mocked and taunted, revealing secrets that only a demon could know. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, everything went silent. The room fell deathly still, and for a moment I dared to hope that it was over. But then, Anna's head snapped towards me, and a slow, malicious smile spread across her cracked lips. "Soon," she whispered, her voice dripping with malice, "I will show you true terror." The words hung in the air, and as they did, the candles flickered and then extinguished all at once, plunging the room into complete darkness. A bone-chilling cold enveloped me, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for the light. But something, some unseen force, kept me rooted in place, unable to move. And then, in the pitch black, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak, like the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was right behind me. My breath caught in my throat and I dared not turn around, fearing what I might see. A hand, cold and clammy, brushed against my neck, and I jerked away, finally finding the strength to reach for the matches in my pocket. With trembling hands, I struck one, the tiny flame flickering to life and casting a dim glow around the room. There was nothing there. Anna lay motionless on the bed, her eyes closed, her body still. The silence was deafening, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew that whatever had just happened was only the beginning. The darkness that had taken hold of Anna Ecklund was far from gone. It was waiting, biding its time, and when it returned, it would bring with it a terror unlike anything I had ever known. The hours after that first encounter with Anna were a blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness had seeped into my very soul. clinging to me like a shadow I couldn't escape. I spent the night in a small, sparsely furnished room within the convent, though sleep was elusive. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind that rattled the windows sent my heart racing. My thoughts were consumed by the image of Anna's twisted smile and the icy touch that had brushed against my neck. By morning, the convent was eerily quiet. The nuns moved through the halls like ghosts, their faces drawn and pale. I could see the fear in their eyes, a fear they tried to hide behind their faith. But it was clear to me that whatever had taken hold of Anna was wearing them down, piece by piece. Father Riesinger found me in the chapel, a cold, dimly lit space that offered little comfort despite its sacred nature. He looked as if he had aged a decade overnight, his eyes hollow and his hands trembling as he clasped his rosary. "She's getting worse," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The demon is growing stronger, and it's starting to affect the entire convent. Last night, Sister Agnes was found in the hallway, muttering in a language none of us could understand. Her eyes, they were black, as if the very light had been sucked out of them." I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever was happening here, it was spreading, like a disease. I had come here seeking answers, but the more I saw, the less I understood. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something was compelling me to stay, to see this through to the end, no matter the cost. We returned to Anna's room, the air thick with tension. The nuns had placed crucifixes along the walls, and the room was bathed in the dim glow of candles. But despite their efforts, the oppressive darkness remained, a palpable force that seemed to drain the very life from the air. Anna lay motionless on the bed, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved, whispering something too faint for us to hear. Father Riesinger stepped closer, leaning in to catch the words, and as he did, Anna's eyes snapped open. The room exploded into chaos. The candles flickered wildly, their flames dancing as if caught in a violent wind, though the air was still. The crucifixes on the walls began to shake, some even falling to the floor with a loud clatter. And Anna, her body convulsed, lifting off the bed as if an unseen force was pulling her up. Her voice, no longer her own, echoed through the room, a deep guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "You dare to challenge me?" the voice bellowed, a mocking tone laced with venom. "You are nothing but worms, crawling in the dirt, blind to the power you face." Father Riesinger, his face pale but resolute, began the exorcism once more, reciting the prayers with a fervor that I had not seen before. But this time, the demon fought back with a terrifying force. Anna's body thrashed violently, her limbs straining against the leather straps, her head twisted at an unnatural angle, her eyes rolling back into her skull. The voice coming from her mouth grew louder, a cacophony of screams, laughter, and cries for help that seemed to come from 1,000 different voices all at once. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Anna collapsed onto the bed, her body limp and lifeless. The room fell into an eerie silence, the only sound the ragged breaths of Father Riesinger as he clutched his rosary. But the silence was short-lived. From the shadows of the room I heard it, a faint, raspy whisper, like the sound of dry leaves being crushed underfoot. It was coming from Anna. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Her lips were moving again, forming words that chilled me to the bone. "He is coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He is coming for you." Before I could react, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang, the force of it shaking the walls. The candles flickered out, plunging us into darkness once more. I reached out, fumbling in the pitch black, trying to find the door, but my hand met only cold, smooth wood. And then I felt it. A presence, cold and malevolent, standing right behind me. I could hear its breath, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the fear that radiated from me. My skin prickled, and a deep sense of dread settled in the pit of my stomach. A low growl rumbled from the shadows, a sound so primal and filled with hatred that it froze me in place. I could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating me, and I knew that whatever was in this room with us was far more powerful, far more evil than anything I had ever encountered. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The candles flickered back to life, casting a weak, trembling light across the room. Anna was lying still on the bed, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow but steady. Father Riesinger looked at me, his face ashen. "This is only the beginning," he said, his voice trembling with fear. "The true battle is yet to come." I wanted to leave, to run as far away from this place as I could, but I knew there was no escaping it. Whatever had taken hold of Anna Ecklund had now marked us all, and there was no turning back. The days that followed were a descent into madness. The convent, once a sanctuary of peace and faith, had become a prison of fear and darkness. The nuns spoke of strange occurrences, faint whispers in the dead of night, shadows that moved on their own, and a pervasive sense of dread that settled over the entire building like a suffocating blanket. Father Riesinger and I continued the exorcisms, but each session left us more drained, more desperate. The demon inside Anna was growing stronger, more violent. It was as if the entity was feeding on our fear, becoming more powerful with each passing day. On the third night, I awoke to the sound of muffled sobbing. The sound was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind that howled outside. But it was there, coming from somewhere deep within the convent. I rose from my bed, my heart pounding in my chest, and followed the sound down the darkened hallway. The sobbing grew louder as I approached the chapel, a mournful wail that echoed off the stone walls. The door to the chapel was slightly ajar, and a flickering light spilled out into the hallway. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but something compelled me to push the door open. What I saw inside the chapel stopped me cold. Anna was there, kneeling at the altar, her back to me. The flickering light came from the candles that had been arranged in a circle around her, their flames casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. She was sobbing, her shoulders shaking with each gasping breath, and I could see her hands clasped tightly together, as if in prayer. But something was wrong, terribly wrong. The air in the chapel was heavy, oppressive, as if the very atmosphere had been tainted by some malevolent force. The shadows on the walls seemed to move with a life of their own, twisting and writhing like dark tendrils reaching out from the abyss. And then I noticed the blood. It was seeping from Anna's hands, dripping onto the stone floor beneath her. The crimson liquid pooled around her knees, spreading out in a slow, deliberate pattern that formed a dark, sinister symbol, one that I recognized immediately. It was a mark of possession, an ancient sigil that I had seen only once before, in the pages of a forbidden text. I called out to her, my voice trembling. "Anna, what are you doing?" She didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. Her sobbing continued, a haunting sound that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. I took a step closer, my hand reaching out to touch her shoulder. But before I could, the candles around her suddenly flared, their flames shooting up like pillars of fire. The room was filled with a blinding light, and I was forced to shield my eyes. When the light finally dimmed, Anna was standing, her back still turned to me. The blood was no longer dripping from her hands. Instead, it had formed a trail leading from the altar to the center of the chapel, where it pooled into a grotesque, pulsating mass. And then slowly she turned to face me. Her eyes, those once beautiful blue eyes, were now completely black, voids of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. Her face was gaunt, twisted into a grotesque mask of pain and anger. But it was her smile, a slow, deliberate curl of her lips, that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice not her own but that of the demon inside her. "He's here." Before I could react, the candles were snuffed out, plunging the chapel into total darkness. I could hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from all around me, but I couldn't see a thing. Panic surged through me as I fumbled in the dark, trying to find my way to the door. But it was as if the chapel had grown impossibly large, the walls receding into the void. And then, just as I was about to scream, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, a void that pressed down on me with the weight of 1,000 pounds. I could feel the presence again. Cold, malevolent, standing just inches away from me. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out all other sound. And then, in the darkness, I heard it, a soft, raspy whisper right by my ear. "Run!" I bolted, my body acting on pure instinct. I ran through the darkness, my hands outstretched, searching for the door, for anything that could lead me out of this nightmare. My fingers finally brushed against the cold wood of the door, and I shoved it open, bursting out into the hallway. The light of the hallway was harsh, blinding, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The walls of the convent blurred as I raced through the corridors, my mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. I finally came to a stop in the courtyard, gasping for breath. The cold night air bit into my skin, but it was a welcome sensation, a reminder that I was still alive. I looked back at the convent, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky, and I knew I couldn't stay here. Not anymore. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the courtyard, just barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall, its form indistinct, but its eyes, those burning yellow eyes, stared at me with an intensity that pierced through the darkness. It was him, the one the demon had warned about. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone, vanishing into the night. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever had taken hold of Anna Ecklund had followed me, and it was only a matter of time before it struck again. I returned to the convent the next morning, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay away. The night's events had left me shaken to my core, but I couldn't abandon Anna. Not now. When the darkness had reached its peak, Father Riesinger met me at the entrance, his face etched with worry. He didn't ask where I had been. He knew that whatever had transpired was beyond our understanding. "The final exorcism must be done today," he said, his voice trembling. "We cannot let this go on any longer. The demon is too strong, and if we fail, I fear it will consume us all." We gathered in the chapel, the very place where I had encountered the entity the night before. The air was thick with anticipation, the tension almost palpable. The nuns had prepared the room, placing crucifixes and holy relics around the altar, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. Anna was brought in, her body limp and unresponsive, as if she had been drained of all life. But the moment she was placed on the altar, her eyes snapped open, and the air around us seemed to crackle with energy. Father Riesinger began the ritual, his voice steady but laced with desperation. The prayers echoed through the chapel, filling the space with a sense of urgency. But the demon within Anna was no longer content to remain silent. "You fools," it hissed, using Anna's voice. "You think your pathetic prayers can stop me? I am eternal. I am beyond your comprehension." The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The walls seemed to close in around us, the shadows growing longer and darker. And then, without warning, Anna's body convulsed, her back arching off the altar as she let out a blood-curdling scream. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard. Inhuman, filled with agony and rage. The candles around the room flickered wildly, their flames bending and twisting as if caught in a violent storm. The nuns clutched their rosaries, their faces pale with fear. But Father Riesinger did not waver. He continued the exorcism, his voice rising above the chaos. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to leave this child of God." Anna's body twisted in unnatural ways, her limbs jerking as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and a guttural growl rumbled from deep within her chest. And then, in a voice that sent a chill down my spine, the demon spoke directly to me. "You cannot save her," it whispered, its tone filled with dark amusement. "She is mine, and so are you." My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the blood drain from my face. The demon's words echoed in my mind, a terrible realization dawning on me. This wasn't just about Anna. This was about me. The entity had marked me that night in the chapel, and now it was coming for me. Father Riesinger's voice grew louder, more forceful, as he recited the final prayer. "By the power of Christ, I compel you to leave this innocent soul." There was a moment of unbearable tension, a silence that pressed down on us like a weight. And then, all at once, the candles were snuffed out, plunging the chapel into darkness. For a heartbeat, everything was still. And then, with a violent jolt, Anna's body was flung off the altar, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. The force of it was so strong that the stone cracked, and I could hear the nuns screaming in terror. I rushed to Anna's side, my hands trembling as I checked for a pulse. She was alive, barely, but the air around us had changed. It was as if the very fabric of reality had been torn open, and something unspeakable had been unleashed. I could feel it, something dark and malevolent, something that had been waiting for this moment. And then, in the pitch black, I saw them, those burning yellow eyes, staring at me from the shadows. The figure from the courtyard was here, watching, waiting. "You have failed," the demon's voice echoed through the chapel. But this time, it wasn't coming from Anna. It was coming from everywhere, surrounding us, filling the very air with its presence. "She belongs to me now, and soon. So will you." The figure stepped out of the shadows, its form finally becoming clear. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that were too long and a face that was a twisted parody of a human's. But it was the eyes, those yellow burning eyes that held me in place, paralyzing me with fear. And then, in a move so swift I barely registered it, the figure lunged at me. The impact was like a sledgehammer, knocking the wind out of me and sending me crashing to the floor. I could feel its hands, cold, clawed, gripping my throat, squeezing the life out of me. The room spun, and I could see Father Riesinger rushing towards me, his face a mask of horror. But it was too late. As my vision began to fade, the last thing I saw was Anna, her eyes wide open but no longer black. They were her eyes again, blue and filled with terror, as she watched the life being drained from me. And then, just as darkness began to consume me, the demon spoke one last time. "You cannot escape," it whispered, its voice filled with a terrible finality. "You are mine, now and forever." Everything went black. I awoke to the sound of distant bells, my body aching and cold. I was lying on the floor of the chapel, the light of dawn filtering through the stained glass windows. My throat burned, and I could feel the bruises forming where the demon had gripped me. But I was alive. Anna was gone. Father Riesinger stood over me, his face pale and drawn. "The demon. It's been driven out," he said, though there was no relief in his voice. "But at a terrible cost." I looked around the chapel, at the cracked stone, the fallen crucifixes, and the blood that still stained the floor. And then I saw it, a small dark mark on my arm, barely visible but unmistakable. The sigil of the demon burned into my flesh. It was then that I understood. The demon hadn't been driven out. It had only found a new host. I could feel it inside me, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it would take full control. I was cursed, bound to this entity for all eternity. The battle was over, but the war had only just begun. As I left the convent, the cold wind biting at my skin, I knew that I could never return to the life I once knew. I was no longer the man I had been before. The demon had marked me, claimed me, and there was no escape. And somewhere, deep within the darkness of my own mind, I could hear its voice, soft, taunting, and filled with malice. "You are mine."